So now it's the time for David Steuerman. He's working in the environmental program of United Nations and in the Secretariat of the Agreement for the Biological Biodiversity in Montreal, in Canada. So thank you very much for coming to Barcelona. And please.
Gracias, buenas tardes. And that's about all my Spanish. Thank you very much, and I do apologize for not being able to have joined you this morning. Unfortunately, with technology and other things did not quite cooperate the way we wanted them to. Today, what I want to discuss is a little bit broader than just biomimetics, but I think it fits in very well. With the convention, we are doing a lot of work on business engagement and looking at how do we actually get businesses to take this issue seriously. How do we get them to understand it? And how do we get them to move? And frankly, biomimetics is a piece of that. It's a part of the business case. So as Dennis was saying, it's actually a very good starting point for me. That when we look at nature as being separate, when we look at environment and economics as being separate things, to be very honest, environment will lose every single time. We've seen this in the recent financial crisis where in Europe and in North America, there was a growing concern about the loss of biodiversity, climate change, until 2008 when the economic crisis hit, and then it's, well, forget it. Doesn't matter. We've got to solve the economy first, and then we'll worry about the environment. This is the wrong thing. The environment is the economy. And once we realize that, then we can begin to make repairs. Biomimetics is a part of that. We have to make the business case. We have to make businesses understand that this is something they need to be taking very seriously. Otherwise, they are in a long-term problem. So what I want to do today is explain a little bit about the business case, a little bit about what biodiversity is. I think probably everyone's familiar. A bit about what we're doing and how we can sort of work together and maybe what we're trying to build and how this would fit in. So very briefly, we look at the value of biodiversity. And are people here familiar with the concept of ecosystem services? The idea of biodiversity, nature has all these wonderful things, and together they create services. The services can be provision of food, they can be sequestration of carbon, they can be the idea of a library where you can copy ideas, biomimicry. Unfortunately, most of these services are defined as services that are applicable to us, that are useful for us. But that is a way that we can see economic value out of this. That's a way we can convince businesses. It's not just pretty to look at, there's actually something more to it. But even saying it's pretty to look at is important because that's a tourism service. That's something that's very important. We can make money out of this, and we can make value, create value. Some people don't like hearing that, but if we don't value it, we can't preserve it. There's actually been a study done, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, called the TEEB study. It's basically the equivalent of Stern to climate change. And it's tried to put some values to biodiversity. And what we find actually is remarkable, that biodiversity, the ecosystem services that are provided, if you measured them at GDP rates, they would be approximately $50 trillion, which is quite a bit greater than the current GDP. And the loss, the overexploitation, the loss of biodiversity, the resultant economic loss that we see, because most of these services are free. Okay, the air we breathe, the water, everything else, we take it for granted, we just use it. But if we actually had to pay for these services, the loss we are seeing is approximately $5 trillion per year. That's what the TEEB says. Now think about that figure for a second. That's roughly the GDP of China per year. So we're basically throwing away the economy of China every year by not paying attention to this. When we think about how much effort we're putting into chasing emerging markets and how important this is, we're crazy doing this. But this is unfortunately what we do. But people, again, are not thinking about biodiversity and environment as part of the business case. And I think both Lynn and Dennis made a very good point in saying this. We have to draw these together. So in terms of value of biodiversity, I think just to put it very briefly, I have more explicit slides, but unfortunately the technology wasn't cooperating with me today, but I think this will suffice. What we can say is that a healthy ecosystem, a system that's vibrant and functional, will lead generally to healthy supply chains, and the supply chains will actually make a business model viable. Now, in a given ecosystem, there may only be one or two elements of that system that are actually important to the supply chain. But you can't just say, we're going to protect that one element and ignore the rest of it. You have to protect the system. If you try to just protect the one element, let everything else die around it, that element's going to be in pretty big trouble. What we find, though, is that what we do is we do a lot of damage to ecosystems, and we especially do a lot of damage to what we call key species, keystone species, the species that actually everything else depends on. And a lot of the problem, again, with research is we often don't know which species that is until we find out the system's actually collapsed, and we go, oh, that was maybe not the species we should have allowed to die. But it's kind of late. You can't do experiments with this hoping that the experiment doesn't turn out really badly in the process. What we do find is that we are putting a lot of pressure on systems through climate change, through urbanization, through industrialization, and just through general misuse. And when we do actually get very degraded degraded ecosystems, we end up with degraded supply chains. Hurting an ecosystem hurts a business model. And there's a direct correlation to this. This is risk management. And we're seeing this repeatedly. If companies don't understand that they are dependent on this, they will exploit it. And then they'll suddenly go, oh, what happened? Well, we need to try to prevent that from happening in the first place. Okay, the business case. So, in terms of the business case, to my mind, these can be classified in two ways. There's really risk management, and there's the opportunities. You can't just say to companies, the sky is falling, you must take care. We actually have to say, look, there are also opportunities, there's ways of making money. But if you don't take care of this, you will suffer consequences. But if you do take care of this, you can actually reap great rewards. So in terms of risks, I think a lot of these are quite well known, but we've got things like negative corporate boycotts, negative images. If you've got a company that is seen as raping and pillaging the environment, consumers tend to back away from it. They want to buy green. You have government legislation where if the legislation suddenly comes in and a company isn't ready, it can be very, very expensive to catch up. The social license to operate as well. If companies are not seen as responsible, they will find it, particularly mining or agricultural companies, they'll find it very hard to work in a given environment. Cleanup costs, compensation costs, insurance companies are seeing this taking this very seriously. A lot of the actions which damage biodiversity it's very hard now to get these insured because insurance companies are aware of the riskiness of the activities. And also the scarcity of resources. This chart you see in the top left. Top left. I'm from Canada, and we've had a very interesting experience with fish stocks, where fish were seen, cod off Newfoundland, the east coast of Canada, was seen as an infinite resource until we could exploit it, and exploit it, and exploit it, until we found out it wasn't infinite at all, and the stocks just collapsed completely, and the industry died. The industry is dead. It's not going to come back. The stocks are beginning to recover a little bit, but nowhere near what they were, and it will take, if they ever come back, it will take centuries for them to come back to the abundance they were. That industry is gone. And again, all the companies, all the people who depended on that industry have suffered. There's an old joke that most of the population who used to fish in Newfoundland have now gone to Alberta to go to the oil sands and mine. It's that's the thing. They've had to find new jobs. They've had to find new ways of doing things. But the opportunities, a lot of these are flip sides, right? Market leadership, enhanced reputation, the fact that a company can be seen as a leader, good relations with regulators, good relation with stakeholders, good relation with governments, so they can actually stay ahead of a curve. They can get lower insurance premiums, access to new funds, which are becoming available, ethical funds. The long-term stability of supply and viability of a company, loyalty, bioprospecting, biomimicry, this is really important as well. And this is also a risk, which I didn't mention in the other slide. There's a really good quote, I don't know if people are familiar with Tom Lovejoy. He worked with, in the US, he worked for the White House in the 1980s. He actually coined the term biodiversity. And he's got a really interesting quote. He says that when we destroy biodiversity, when we destroy nature, it's like having a library and burning the library before we've read the books. We don't know what there is. We don't know the next discoveries that are going to be inspiring biomimicry, inspiring the next inventions. But if we destroy it before we've even had a chance to study it. The opportunities and the inventions and the potential we've lost is immense. The next cure for whatever disease you like, the next revolution in whatever could be right around the corner. But if we have destroyed that species that has been programmed by its DNA to do whatever function we need, we've lost that. There are also supply management costs, which are much lower. We actually find that if you're clean and have actually lower costs, this is something that's very easy to do. And there's also something, Lynn actually made a point which I thought was very interesting when we're talking about management and education and changing the way people think, and Dennis mentioned this as well. We often come to environmental issues, biodiversity, as saying, this is a risk, we have to take care of nature, we have to preserve it, and you have to do this, otherwise it will happen. And the companies come back and say, well, but it's expensive, it's risky, it's going to be, there's all this and that, we don't know what the future is going to hold. Well, let's see, we'll take our time. Business as usual is okay, right? You've all heard this, right? I have a question for people here, just a sample. How many people have smartphones, iPhones? Can you just raise your hands? Pretty much everybody, right? 30 years ago, this would have been science fiction. This would have been magic. This was actually science fiction. This is, Star Trek, Star Wars type technology. If you said to a company 30 years ago, you have to make this. You've got 30 years or you're going to be out of business. And by the way, it's going to cost you cumulatively trillions of dollars to do this. You're going to put millions of people out of work. Every single person in your company, excuse me, from a CEO right down to the janitor who's cleaning the toilets, is going to have to relearn their job because they're going to have to get used to this. It's going to destroy industry after industry. It's going to cause everything. Our children are going to just never go outside again because they're playing video games. Everything. You have to invent new technology, and you have to put it in the palm of your hand. It has to be cheap, and it has to connect every living person and the sum total of human knowledge. Get to it. Every company is going to look at you and go, "You're out of your minds. We can't do this. This is impossible." Well, guess what? We've done it. It was easy, and we all embraced it. We all depend on these things now. What we're saying about the revolution in terms of biodiversity, looking at, and which biomimicry is a part of this, looking at the revolution in terms of sustainable use, is exactly the same thing. It's actually far less disruptive, and we'll get far greater benefits. We have to look at this as opportunities. Biomimicry is really important to this. This is an opportunity. This is a great opportunity. As Lynn was saying, it's a great bridge. But if we look at it as a risk, companies are afraid. If we say, this is right around the corner, this is a new industry, this is a new Microsoft, this is a new Apple, this is a new whatever, people go, hey, wow, okay, let's get started. That's the attitude we have to have. So, getting to us, the Convention on Biological Diversity. So what do? We have been mandated to get involved in business engagement. During COP, our Conference of Parties, in 2010, we were mandated to engage with the business community, and this is reinforced at our next meeting, our next major, we have these every 2 years, in Hyderabad, in India, in 2012. I don't expect you to read these decisions, but basically the decisions are calling for greater dissemination of information, greater dissemination of case studies, which would include biomimicry, tools and information, but also, and this again comes down to a point that both Lynn and Dennis are making, encouraging dialogue. Particularly dialogue between business and government, but also other stakeholders, NGOs, academics, all other sectors. What we find right now is basically governments don't really trust business. Business certainly don't trust governments. NGOs don't trust business. Businesses think NGOs are suspicious. No one trusts the UN. But if we actually work together, we can actually get on top of this. And this is what we're trying to work on. So our strategy is fourfold. We're working on with countries to help set the legislative agenda. We basically are saying these are the things you need to do, and you have to have regulation. You have to improve that. What are the things we can do? What are the regulations? How can we eliminate perverse subsidies? How can we actually reform the tax base so that the taxation system is more friendly? We're not penalizing green companies, and we're not subsidizing brown companies. We're actually doing it the other way around. We're making it friendly. We also have to encourage market pull. This is, again, very important for biomimicry. Let's say you came up with the next great invention. You had something like, I don't know, from a gecko, where you can climb walls. And it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, but no one actually wants to buy it. A lot of companies are going to go out of business. You actually have to make sure that the green products that are being produced, whether biomimic or not, actually have a market. And this is something very, very important, that you have to make sure governments, and particularly large companies at the head of supply chains, are buying the products that are being made, and that there's commitment. That will encourage others to go forward. Okay? Facilitation of information flow, best practices, case studies, sharing what the academics know, sharing what companies are doing with biomimetics and such, making sure this is available. But we also have to make sure that the information is digestible. A lot of companies, especially small, medium-sized companies, really are going to struggle to understand this. And what we find often is, it's not that there's not enough information. There's lots of information. There's a sea of information out there. But there's so much companies drown in it. We don't even know where to begin. I've been studying this stuff for 2 years since I've joined the CBD. And every time I look at a new paper, I'm just lost. Because I find there's so much, I don't even know where to begin. Now, I've got my time to study this. Some poor company, a poor guy in a small company who's doing CSR work and climate change and biodiversity and then, biomimicry, what's that, and everything else. They're not going to be able to find this, but we have to make the information understandable and digestible, easy to communicate, and then they'll get it. And then we also have to provide services to the companies, help the companies actually access this information through consultants or whatever, to help them take the first step and the second step. By the time they take that, we find most companies are off and running because they realize that it's profitable for them. So our way of engaging, we have a website where we actually have tools, mechanisms such, www.cbd.int/business. I invite you to visit it. It's a wonderful website. We do outreach to business. We encourage businesses to share their case studies. We use our website, newsletters, workshops, events such as this, to spread the word about what we're doing. National workshops where we go, rather than having all the companies come to us, we go to them. We go to different countries and actually speak to audiences. Particularly those audiences that are not necessarily convinced of us already. Try to make newcomers, make people understand. And we're working with governments on green procurement. We're also doing a lot of analysis and dissemination of information. We're working to analyze standards. Again, there's lots of standards out there, but sometimes the standards don't actually say the same thing, or when they say the same thing, they don't mean the same thing. And I mean, all of you probably have this experience. We go into a supermarket and see the green labels. Well, one green label doesn't equal the next green label, which doesn't equal the next green label, and frankly, some of them don't even mean anything, but again, you have to be an expert to understand this. I've heard of, there's some studies out that say we should actually not even look at green labels. Labels should be away. They should be gone. It should be de facto green. It's the same thing if you buy clothing, you don't have a label saying slave trade free. It's assumed you're not going to have slavery making these labels. It should be assumed that things should be green. The biomimetics, everything else should be the normal. It should not be the wow, isn't this a great addition? It should be the normal because, to be honest, consumers will make the wrong decision. As I said, we also have a lot of partners. We have our website, we're disseminating case studies, and we also have partners. This is just a sampling at the bottom, who do a lot of this information, and we help to facilitate the flow of information between them. And we'd be very happy to put the Biomimetics Foundation in touch with many of these. I think some of them would find it very, very interesting. I also want to mention just the last little bit of this. One of the mandates from our decision was something called the Global Partnership for Business and Biodiversity. What we found was that there are many different organizations, like the Biomimetics Institute, but many others, who are talking to companies and helping companies, but they don't actually talk to each other. So you get different organizations doing the same sorts of things, often competing with each other, not sharing information, and it's a duplication of effort, and the companies go around and say, well, who do I talk to? Who's best? Do I talk to them or them or them? Where do I go? What we're trying to do with the Global Partnership is actually, in different countries, bring together all the various players and get them to actually talk to each other, which is a novel thing, and maybe even cooperate a bit, and actually try to compare information, share best practices, and where there are common projects, maybe work together, so they can actually save some money. This actually is something we find that can be very useful. It also makes it much more authentic for the companies. The big companies see this as being serious. The small companies can actually get the information much more easily. The map here shows the countries right now that are involved. The blue are countries that have these national initiatives already in place. Includes my home country, Canada, but also Japan, Brazil, South Africa, several European countries. The grey are countries where actually these are forming. In fact, this map is out of date, and a lot more of these should be blue now. But we do have big economies like India, like China, Australia, South Korea. We're getting a lot more. We're getting a number of countries in Africa getting involved. We've got a lot more countries in Peru. This map, as I say, is actually out of date right now. There's a lot more countries that are getting involved. And it's picking up steam. In fact, in a couple of days, I'm going to be in the UK, again, trying to kickstart one of these things into place. So I just want to explain what this partnership is, how it works. So you've got, let's say, different countries, different regions. In every country, you have businesses. You have associations, business associations, government, academia, NGOs, IGOs. And as I said, most of them, if you're lucky, they talk to each other occasionally, but they don't talk to each other in a systematic way. But we need to make sure that happens. So the national initiatives are actually a network, bringing together all these players. Each one still retains its own niche, but they talk to each other, communicate. And then what we're doing with the global partnership is a network of networks. And it looks like a little spider web, so it's a nice little ecosystem of networks. But again, by bringing these together, where our hope is that we will actually increase some understanding, and we won't solve the problem ourselves, but we may actually just add a little bit of lubrication, just smooth it out, speed things up a little bit. And then for our next steps, we're still working on the partnership. We're working on further work on best practices, further work on other issues, including ABS, which is access and benefit sharing, which has some importance for biomimicry. Work on sustainable procurement. And we're also going to be moving towards COP12, our Conference of Parties, which will take place in Korea. I would very strongly encourage the Biomimetics Institute to get involved in that. I think there'd be a very interesting place in those discussions, and I can obviously provide that information. As a final slide, I'd just like to say that we're working with partners, but again, this is not something we can do by ourselves. Okay? Governments, businesses, academia, NGOs have to work together. If we don't, we're done. We're not going to get ahead of this, and we're going to be in trouble. If we work together, we have a chance of making this possible. It's a big challenge, but it's not as scary as it seems. It's also very important that we don't just get big companies. We have to get the small, medium enterprises. We have to get the supply chains involved. We also have to get the message out. I think people in this room are everyone's interested in this subject. And most of the lectures I go to, people are interested. Some people go, wow, this is a really great idea and things. To be honest with you, I don't want to be talking to those guys. Because, it's good, but I want to talk to the people who go, no, this is rubbish. And I want to sit down with them and say, no, this is why you need to get involved, because those are the guys we need to do. It's the iceberg. We've got thousands of companies who are doing great work, but there are millions of companies who don't even begin to understand this. Those are the ones we've got to get to. So I think what's been done here is fantastic. I think the work with the biomimicry is very interesting. I think it's worth exploring. I think a lot of people do this without even realizing it's biomimicry, and I think maybe we have to be a bit more inclusive in that. There's been a lot of work that's been done, but we've got a lot further to go, and I'd like to invite you to help us move forward on this. Thank you very much.
David, what would be necessary in order to make that Catalonia and Spain would be blue color in your map?
I'm sorry, can you say it?
No. What is necessary to make Catalonia and Spain in order to be blue color in your map?
Spain already has started blue. There's actually an initiative they're based in Madrid. I was supposed to go see them, but of course because my flight was late, I missed it. But we've actually were in Montreal with us last month, and they are involved. I would be very happy to put you in touch with them. They're looking for additional partners. But Spain is actually one of those that's actually turned blue very recently. And they're doing some work, and they're actually helping us encouraging other countries in Europe and also in Latin America. We also have, for our global partnership meeting, we have that every year. 1 year it's on the COP, and then we have it another year. Spain has actually expressed an interest in hosting it in 2015, so that could be interesting as well. But I would certainly put you in touch with them. I think they'd be very interested in the work we've done here.
Thank you very much.